A report by Human Rights Watch is warning that foreign workers in Qatar risk serious abuse in the run-up to the 2022 Football World Cup. What will it take to protect the rights of these workers? And just how complicated is the issue across the Gulf region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Ghida Fakhri. Qatar, the home of Al Jazeera and one of the wealthiest countries in the world. If you calculate national riches in relation to the size of the population, it comes out top. But a recent report by Human Rights Watch highlighted the plight of the 1.2 million migrant workers who live here. Many work in construction, and many more will be needed to build the stadiums and other infrastructure needed for the 2022 World Cup. But the report says these workers are at risk of serious abuse and exploitation. Charles Stratford has more.
The gleaming towers symbolise success and immense wealth in the richest country per capita on earth. But the story for many of the thousands of Asian workers building Qatar's dream is very different. At the Ministry of Labour Complaints Office, we find Jayraj, who's from India. He says he and around 30 of his colleagues haven't been paid in more than 3 months.
We cannot even return to our countries because we don't have money. Our company says wait for 2 months, but wait where? Back home I have my mother, a wife and 2 children to feed. It's a pity that I can't even look after my children.
Qatar's Ministry of Labour says one of the most common complaints filed against companies is over unpaid wages. A representative of Jayrav's company management told Al Jazeera the men would get their salaries in a month's time. We drive to Jayrav's accommodation, which his employers rent. This is a typical camp for foreign labourers here in Qatar. Now around 600 men live here, and the conditions they live under are shocking. Jayraj says they were forced to move here recently after the water in their previous camp was cut off because the owner had not paid the bill. He says they had to carry water in buckets from another camp nearby. Up to 6 men live in these rooms. Deepak looks at photographs of his wife and daughter back in India.
My family don't know I live like this. They would worry about us, that's why we don't tell them. I paid the agent in India about $1,400 to come here. I've just finished paying the loan off, but I have nothing left.
The kitchen facilities in the building are in a terrible condition. The men admit they could do more to keep the place clean, but say the building owner never supplied the basics in the first place.
We have 8 cooking rings and we have to cook for 30 people. We don't have even a space to keep the food. We have to eat standing up. There's no fridge, but we manage.
At another camp, we find up to 16 men living in one room. They say their company does pay them on time, but we ask one of the men how much he gets.
I get paid around $190 a month. I have 7 kids. They're still young. I'm the only one to feed all of them.
The Ministry of Labour says it's trying to improve monitoring and punishing companies that do not comply with its labour laws. And this is not a story specific to Qatar. The International Labour Organization says Gulf countries must do more to protect the rights of foreign workers. It's men like these who often have no choice but to return to their homeland with little or nothing to show for their efforts to improve their lives. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera, Doha.
Qatar isn't the only Gulf state with a big population of migrant workers. In many parts of the region, foreign workers outnumber locals. Qatar has a population of 1.7 million, of which 94% are believed to be migrants. Of the 7.5 million people in the United Arab Emirates, some 80% are believed to be migrants. They make up around 2/3 of the 2.7 million population of Kuwait and a quarter of Bahrain's 1.2 million, while almost 30% of Oman's 2.7 million people are foreigners, and Saudi Arabia, which is the largest Gulf state, has a population of 27 million, of which around 30% are migrants. So will Qatar and other Gulf countries protect the rights of their foreign workers? To discuss this, we're joined by Zahra Babar, Assistant Director of Research at the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Doha, and Tim Noonan, Director of Campaigns and Communications at the International Trade Unions Confederation in Brussels. and we reached out to government representatives in Qatar to take part in the program, but our requests were declined. Zahra Babar, I know that you documented the plight of some of these foreign workers, certainly here in Qatar. Behind all the glitz and glamour that we see, not just in this country, but across the GCC, with an estimated foreign workforce of about 35 million people, how grim, how complicated, how difficult is their reality?
Rida, it's a question that researchers focused on the Gulf for the past 2 decades have been looking at. As you yourself pointed out earlier when you went over some of the figures regarding the presence and numbers of migrant workers and migrants in general, they're quite astronomical. The proportions of migrants to nationals are huge, particularly so in Qatar, the UAE and Kuwait. And it's a phenomenon that's only grown in the last couple of decades, despite stated and articulated government policy, which is that this is a temporary phenomena, that over the long course the labour market will normalize, will actually employ mainly nationals. But the fact is the dependency on these external supply, on the external supply of labour is something that's continuing, and it's only going to grow. With the sort of development plans that Qatar has for the future, one expects that the numbers of workers coming in will only continue. Researchers have been trying to examine the sort of lived experiences of migrant workers for about 20 years. And ethnographic research conducted by anthropologists and sociologists obviously paints a diverse picture. It's not to say that every single migrant who comes to the GCC ends up in a situation of deep exploitation, or that there are absolutely no benefits to it. Clearly, the fact that there are almost circular patterns of people coming and going and back and forth means that there is some development benefit to particular migrants.
And there certainly will be a lot of people coming and going. Yes. When we talk about the foreign workforce, especially in Qatar, in the lead up to the 2022 World Cup.
Absolutely.
Tim Noonan, Human Rights Watch particularly looks at this type of drive to recruit, to employ construction workers. Out of the 1.2 foreign workers apparently here in Qatar, some 500,000 are employed in construction. So looking at what is going on, the dynamics, the laws, the regulations, what is being implemented and what isn't, who should the onus be on? Should it be up to the local authorities to make sure that some of the laws are implemented, or is it up to FIFA, up to the contractors who bring in these foreign workers? Where should the onus be?
Well, all of the parties have responsibilities, and we're of course in talks with FIFA. We're reaching out to the companies in the sector, but the fundamental responsibility rests with the authorities of Qatar. We have done our own research, which confirms the findings of the report which Human Rights Watch released yesterday. And we've done a lot of work in the sending countries as well. You take the case of Nepal, one of the significant suppliers of migrant labour to the construction industry in Qatar. Last year, in the first 10 months of 2011, 161 Nepali construction workers died in Qatar. 161 people. And that's only something like a quarter, a third perhaps of the overall workforce in the construction sector in Qatar. This is a situation of industrial anarchy, and the way that migrant workers are in many cases tricked into the kind of binding contracts, almost a form of modern-day slavery, in fact, is completely unacceptable.
But I do want to pick on this point, though. You just mentioned all these cases of deaths among some of these construction workers, yet in a letter to Human Rights Watch, the Ministry of Labour says in the last 3 years there were only 6 cases of deaths. How can the government be oblivious to what is going on? I mean, why such a discrepancy in the figures?
Well, the question is really whether the authorities care enough about the situation. We haven't seen any comprehensive statistics compiled by the authorities in Qatar. There have been some health surveys done over the years which tend to support the evidence that we're receiving from the sending countries. But the reality is to get even an indication of the mortality rate, the number of workers who are losing their lives. The counting of the dead bodies arriving has to be done at the airports in the sending countries when these victims of this industrial anarchy, when their coffins return home. This is really a disgraceful situation. It's hard to explain how little care and responsibility has been shown over the years.
The government would, of course, refute this. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but let me bring in Zahra Babar. The government would refute this. In fact, in a statement they put out in reaction to the report by Human Rights Watch, the government says that it is ensuring international standards for workers' rights and conditions, has and will continue to be at the forefront of their committee's strategic planning and implementation. How genuine are the reforms that are going on?
Rida, I would interject that from the Qatari government perspective and in terms of certain labour laws that exist here, what they've often said in their defence, which is true, which is that they do have labour policy, they do have a legal system which is meant to enhance the protection and rights of workers. They may have certain things which are problematic, like the lack of unionisation or the lack of a minimum wage, but they have constructed policies, labour policies around maximum work hours, workplace safety, HSC, minimum standards for housing, and of course the fact that contracts that are signed are legally binding and employers are the ones who are at fault.
But is that the case though? I mean, they may have some of the laws that are written down and they certainly have a human rights, workers' rights book.
Right.
But is anyone respecting this? Are regulations and workers' rights being implemented, being adhered to?
Well, I think the problem is, those of us who studied this, is that there is a lack of governance and there's a lack of ability to enforce or implement any of these laws. Whether that's just malintention or, I would argue, frankly, it's a lack of capacity also. And the main problem, as has been alluded to, is the sponsorship system whereby the employers are the ones who are really given the ability to govern migration. And that's one of what we see as a problematic, is the kafala system, the sponsorship system, which associates workers directly with the employers, in a way has privatized the governance of migration. A number of those of us researching migration policy feel this is the issue.
So just how central then is this question of kafala, as you say, of sponsorship? Despite the allegations of migrant workers about being exploited in many Gulf countries, some steps have been taken to begin to prove their situation, according to government officials. In May, Qatar's Labour Ministry said it was considering scrapping that sponsorship system. Bahrain abandoned its sponsorship program back in 2009, and Kuwait has announced that it will be following suit. And earlier this month, the UAE and Saudi Arabia voted in favor of a convention by the International Labour Organization that establishes global standards for how domestic workers are treated. Tim Noonan, when you look at this issue of sponsorship, which many people would argue is extremely restrictive, which leads to foreigners in these Gulf states feeling wholly dependent on the contractors, the locals themselves who employ them. How problematic is it?
Well, it's one of three central problems in this situation. Certainly the kafala system and the use of effectively people traders, the agents who operate and who bring these migrant workers in, very often under false pretenses, is a major part of the problem. There are reputable companies who should be in the system, who the Qatari authorities should be working with, companies that do respect international standards, and that's one of the issues we raised with the acting minister this week in Geneva. The second major problem, and it's not a side problem or a small problem, is the complete absence of the freedom of association for the workforce in Qatar. The International Labour Organization has a very clear international standard on this question. Workers must be allowed to form and join their own trade unions, to elect their own representatives, and to look after their own interests. And the complete absence of that right in Qatar is one of the most serious problems confronting the whole country. The third issue, and it has been alluded to, is the question of capacity. Now, sometimes the capacity issue is a reasonable excuse. There is a reasonable rationale in a very poor country that it's not able to build the infrastructure to ensure that laws are not only existing on paper, but they're enforced. Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world, and it has no capacity excuse. We first raised these issues formally with the minister more than a year ago, based on our report in May of 2011. Since then, we've seen some statements in the media. We may set up a committee of some sort. There may be some marginal modifications to the legislation. When we met with the Minister finally after 12 months this week, we saw no genuine will, no genuine indication that Qatar is prepared to balance that privilege that it has now as a country hosting major international events such as the World Cup with the responsibilities and the obligations to respect international law. And that law on freedom of association is the central issue.
So Zahra
Without
Babar,
respect for that law, the deaths will continue, the exploitation will continue.
Or an issue of genuine will? How likely are these countries, among them Qatar, but others as well, to dismantle these systems that they have in place?
I think it's something which obviously it's under discussion and under consideration. There have been a couple of different regional and international engagement bodies that Qatar and the other GCC states have been involved in. There was the Colombo process, and then followed on by the Abu Dhabi dialogue, which is a system which brought together the 6 GCC receiving states along with a number of sending countries to try and think about ways to improve the system, clearly in recognition of the fact that it cannot continue as it is, that the absence of rights, workers' rights and migrants' rights is problematic. But those processes haven't directly been felt in the form of a complete dismantling of the kafala. And whether that is going to occur, honestly, well, it's hard to predict at this stage. There are vested interests, business interests within each of these states who argue that if you remove the sponsorship system, you will remove the sort of competitive edge. And how you can actually convince broad sectors and different actors that the kafala needs to be done with remains to be seen. Bahrain, as you mentioned, has repealed it. We have, however, not any concrete or empirical evidence that this has created any change, because many of the structures of the older sponsorship laws still exist. They've just been transferred to a government authority. And the basic rights of workers that are curtailed through the kafala is what we're talking about: the right to change employment, the right to workplace mobility. Currently, the sorts of associations mean that there's absolutely no chance for people to leave exploitative conditions.
And there's very poor, of course, needless to say, living and working conditions,
yes,
safety conditions as well that these workers have to contend to. The fact that they sign up to something back in their countries through these contractors, only to find that the reality is completely different. Exactly. What avenues do they have, though, to turn to, Tim Noonan? I mean, what kind of avenues can they have in the absence of local trade unions?
Well, very, very few. We saw in your introduction piece that there are some people who are prepared to say, to put it bluntly, to take the risk of raising their cases with the Labour Ministry. We know of cases, and we know of cases from talking to workers who've returned to the South Asian countries from whence they came, that raising complaints can mean real problems with the employer, because the employer has total power over the workers. There's a very simple step that the Qatar government needs to take, and that is to fully recognise the right to freedom of association, in line with the standards of the International Labour Organisation. Once it takes that step, the workers will be able to begin to look after their own interests, to organise themselves, and to equalise the very unequal power relationship that exists at the moment. Unless that is done, and unless the kafala system is genuinely done away with, and the other legislative measures not only written but implemented, we will have a World Cup where more workers will have died preparing the stadiums and building the infrastructure. More workers will have died than players will play in the World Cup. That is unacceptable. And our message to FIFA and the dialogue that we're continuing with them is that they should not have a World Cup in that situation. It's not acceptable.
Is that the right solution then? Do you think that kind of pressure, Zahra Babar, is that the solution? Can that work?
I mean, I think that we have to be a little more pragmatic. I mean, I completely agree with Tim on all he's saying in terms of the fact that absolutely we have to put workers' health, safety, protect all their rights. I completely agree with that. But in terms of whether they will allow unionization, I don't know about that. There's a completely different labour market scenario here. But I want a couple points to touch on. One is that Tim had mentioned the situation of labor brokerages, profiteering agency based in the Gulf, who cause a lot of the problems of exploitation and abuse. I just want to add that from my research perspective, this actually is a system which also ties in the sending countries. So it's not a solution, frankly, that you can only put on the receiving state. So we're talking about the profit-generating mechanism, which is the commodification of labor. The sending countries actually have to also be on board, both for vigilance in practice and also in policy.
But are the authorities in these countries burying their heads in the sand effectively, because they've known about these problems? You yourself pointed out that they've known for a couple of decades, yet what are they doing about it in practical terms? They have this workers' rights book, 84 pages of which I've looked at a few, but some of the issues that are very clearly outlined, for example, is that it is not legal for Qatari contractors to charge any amount of fees or expenses for bringing the worker to work here. It's illegal to work without a written signed contract. Really? Is anyone checking?
Exactly. I mean, that's the issue. The fact is, I think they have things on paper which are just not implemented, partially, as has been discussed earlier, because of the employers really governing the process of migration management themselves, the government staying out of it. I do think they're making a few efforts in Qatar, whether they're tokenistic, whether they will actually lead to any results. We can only be hopeful. They are trying to enable the judicial, they keep saying the judicial mechanism is what workers can turn to in cases where they feel exploited or they feel their contractual obligations are not being met. They are talking of setting up facilities which will assist workers who have cases to press against their employers to actually go through the court system. There have been efforts made through a few agencies, organizations here like the NHRC, to inform migrant workers more about their rights, the duties their employers have, and the sorts of general labor protections that exist in the country. But clearly a lot more needs to be done. They have to look into these situations with much greater concern, and the government has to recognize this. They can no longer devolve migrant labor governance down to the private sector, down to citizen employers. This has to be something that the government takes ownership of.
Obviously, Tim Noonan, if the governments took ownership of this issue, if there was real accountability, if some of these contractors were penalised every time they flouted these international and local labour laws, would they continue to do it?
Well, certainly enforcement and proper legislation is central, and it's one of the key issues. But I'd just like to return to this question again, because it is the central issue. I come from a country that was built on migrant labour.
Could you possibly address this question first about accountability,
yes,
whether enough is being done at that level?
No, certainly not enough is being done. The figures and the facts speak for themselves. Very marginal efforts, if any, serious engagement in the enforcement of whatever legislation exists is largely absent. So, but I want to stress that that's only one of the pillars that needs to be addressed. While the workers are continually deprived of their fundamental right to freedom of association, this is a right enshrined in international law at the United Nations, the International Labour Organization. These are fundamental human rights, and if a country like Qatar wants to play in the sphere of the big international events, then it has to accept that responsibility. It has to bring its legislation into line with the ILO standards, and that's the dialogue that we've now begun with the minister in Qatar. We haven't seen the willingness yet, but we do believe that with sufficient dialogue and pressure, we can achieve that.
Tim Noonan, understood, but in the last minute that we've got left, if I can just address this to Zahra Babar, how much can the situation really improve on this front when you've got in Qatar, but let me just stress that this is a situation that we see in so many of the GCC countries. How much difference can you make when you've got apparently just 150 monitors who are supposed to see whether these laws, these regulations are implemented, and when they apparently conduct their work without interviewing the employees, the workers themselves?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that's it. I really think they need to build in a great deal of capacity. They need to have a number of people, the adequate number of people who can go and monitor workplace safety, who can go and check on the housing situation, who can actually engage and that's part of the ownership, to show that they have the people who can actually go out and implement their own laws. I think that is crucial, and I think that can certainly help in dealing with some of the issues around safety and some that Tim has raised.
Obviously, still much work to be done. In the meantime, let's thank our guests, Zahra Babar in Doha and Tim Noonan in Brussels. And thank you very much indeed for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. You can send us your feedback by emailing us your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching.